Boy, it's fun to be here. Thank you all so much for coming, ladies and gentlemen. I think we have a few more gentlemen, but glad to see the ladies that we have. We have a few people here that were at the original Thorium Energy Alliance conference. If you could stand up just a moment. Who was here the first time? All right, excellent. Thank you so much for coming again. My name's Kirk Sorensen. I run a blog called Energy from Thorium. I'm a grad student in nuclear engineering. I work for that guy back there, Larry Miller, and it's good enough to come. I am so glad to be back at Google again, and I especially want to thank our hosts and some of the key folks at Google that have made this happen. Chris Hewlett. Chris, could you stand up for a minute? And Ian McClatchy. And where's Kat Allred? She has just been...
She's up front.
She's up front. She's been fantastic making this happen. Certainly want to thank the Thorium Energy Alliance for all the work they've done to prepare for this event. And I want to thank all of you for coming. I know that, like me, most of you are probably here on vacation time or on your own nickel to make this happen. And it's just proof of how important we think this is that we're doing that. Try to see if I can... As we have for most of human history, we stand today on the edge of an energy crisis. And the methods by which we have powered our society have come to a limit, and change is necessary. 700 years ago in England, the energy crisis was caused by massive deforestation and a lack of firewood. And it was solved by turning to coal, a filthy, inexpensive, and abundant fuel. But as the skies darkened over England and the United States, people turned to gas and oil to improve the situation. Now all of these fossil fuels will have to be replaced due to the environmental damage they cause and the social, political, and financial instability that they engender. Fortunately, in 1939, humanity discovered the physical process that will allow us to replace fossil fuels forever: the fission of heavy elements known as actinides. By 1944, we realized there were actually 3 different ways to use this physical process to provide us the energy that we need. One of these approaches was fairly easy. It involved the use of a substance as rare as gold, uranium-235. Even back then, physicists and scientists realized that uranium-235 fission was not going to be a long-term energy solution. There simply wasn't enough of it. The other 2 approaches were significantly more difficult, but promised essentially unlimited amounts of energy. One was to fission the common isotope of uranium, uranium-238, and the other was to fission thorium, which was 3 times more abundant than uranium itself. In one of the great tragedies of human history, this marvelous new energy source was discovered during a time of war and was immediately put to work for destructive means. This colored and affected forever how world leaders and the public would view this incredible discovery, and it is a legacy that we find ourselves, even 70 years later, still trying to move past. We have taken the easy route. We have used nuclear energy based primarily on the fission of this rare as gold isotope of uranium. And as predicted, its effect has been significant but not overwhelming. We still live on a planet where most of our energy comes from fossil fuels. Even more troubling, most of our fellow citizens and leaders don't know about the other 2 approaches. They assume that nuclear energy means one and only one thing: making energy from nuclear fission the same way we've done it for 60 years. Taking this approach has helped us in many ways, but it's also created enemies and easy ways to stir up the public against nuclear fission. One of the most commonly employed is the specter of catastrophic disaster. While many of us know that these events are not possible in well-built Western-style reactors, it takes a few moments to explain the defense-in-depth approach of our reactors to a regular person, while it only takes a fraction of a second for anti-nuclear forces to say Chernobyl and stoke fear. Another potent source of anti-nuclear anger surrounds the issue of so-called nuclear waste. We tend not to call it that because we realize it's simply spent nuclear fuel with valuable materials that can be utilized to generate energy or provide benefit to society. As much as I'd like to think that our message is getting across, I still find over and over again that nuclear power is demonized as a toxic, dangerous, and poisonous substance that will last forever and is an intractable solution. Such a statement, of course, is untrue, but it is politically and culturally potent. A slightly more sophisticated attack on nuclear power has to do with the high costs involved in building a conventional nuclear power plant. They're really high. And once an organization commits to build one, their uncertainty levels are high. Some endangered species might get discovered on their site. Some anti-nuclear group might rile up a local community or a powerful politician. Fossil fuel interests threatened by loss of market share might quietly fund all manner of subversive efforts. Construction might be shoddy, oversight might be onerous, or public opinion might have a decided shift during the construction period. All of these factors combine to give pause to those who consider building conventional nuclear reactors. Several additional factors have come into play in the last few years. One is that the Obama administration has canceled the U.S. effort to build a permanent spent nuclear fuel repository at Yucca Mountain. Another is that both the Obama and Bush administrations have made efforts to provide loan guarantees to new nuclear power plants. And yet another is the severe economic downturn around the world and a general reduction in the appetite for energy that has led to temporarily lower fuel costs. Natural gas and oil seem cheap for the moment. All of these factors combine to create what I like to think of as boundary conditions. If any of you suffered through a math class in differential equations like I did in college, you remember that boundary conditions establish where you start and where you might end, and they have everything to do with how your solution comes out. Here's our boundary conditions as I see them. First, we can't keep using fossil fuels. They're destroying our environment and exporting wealth away from our country. But those who control the fossil fuels have vast amounts of power and money and can make life very difficult for those of us trying to establish a new energy source. Second, canceling Yucca Mountain, continuing to operate our 100-odd reactors, and building new nuclear reactors in the future mean that we have to do something about what the public calls nuclear waste. And I think it has to be a lot more than just education, even though I think that's an important part of it. We need to address the problem in a satisfactory way. I know we won't satisfy everyone, but we need to satisfy most of the public. Third, we have to do something about the cost of bringing new nuclear energy online. The old way is slow and expensive. We need a new way that's better, safer, simpler, and costs less. Unfortunately, all of these things don't have to be mutually exclusive. Now, what nuclear approach should we take? What about continuing to do things the way we do today, just building more light water reactors that use uranium fuel? Well, each one of these reactors consumes about 250 tons of uranium for each gigawatt year of electrical power they produce. And each of them generate about 35 tons of spent nuclear fuel for each gigawatt year of operation. Right now, we only get about 100 gigawatts of power from nuclear. To get off coal and fossil fuels and to replace the transportation energy we currently get from oil will take about 1,000 gigawatts of electrical power, about 10 times as much as we're getting from nuclear today. This means that we will be using 250,000 tons of uranium produced each year and generating 35,000 tons of spent nuclear fuel. We're not even mining uranium anymore in the United States. We import it all. And considering that Yucca Mountain, which we're not even going to build anymore, is politically limited to 70,000 tons of spent nuclear fuel, that would mean that we would be filling a Yucca Mountain equivalent every 2 years. It's pretty hard to imagine pulling off such a solution in today or even tomorrow's political environment. But what if we reprocess spent nuclear fuel? We could recover the unburned plutonium and we could mix it with fresh uranium to provide fuel for new nuclear reactors. Well, that doesn't change the story too much either, because it takes 2 or 3 nuclear reactors worth of spent fuel to supply another one. The basic problem there is that each current nuclear reactor isn't producing enough new fissile fuel to compensate for that which is being consumed. What about fast reactors? These are reactors that don't slow down their neutrons, so they can get better fuel efficiency and fuel conversion. Fast reactors theoretically could fit the bill. If we assume that each fast reactor would consume about half the energy in uranium, then 1,000 fast reactors would only use about 2,000 tons of uranium a year. And we have lots of uranium sitting around at enrichment plants. But there's a few other issues of concern with the fast reactors. First of all, depending on the specifics of the design, each one is going to take 5 to 10 tons of fissile material to start up per gigawatt of power production. And the exact numbers aren't publicly available, but it's a pretty good guess that our current spent fuel inventory is about 70,000 tons, with about 1% of that is plutonium that could be used to start fast reactors. Then we'd have about 700 tons of plutonium that we could use to start fast reactors, and that would start about 70 to 100 of these. And we would need each of these 70 fast reactors to breed lots more plutonium in order to be able to start more fast reactors. Or we would have to enrich a lot of uranium to start fast breeder reactors. We would also need to build the fuel and reprocessing facilities to make all this happen. It's possible, but it's going to be very expensive. Then there's thorium. Thorium has a special property. it breeds to uranium-233, and uranium-233 fissions and gives off 2 or 3 neutrons that enable it to keep converting more thorium to uranium-233 and burning it. This means that once we start a thorium reactor, we can keep it going indefinitely just by adding thorium. But how do we get it started, and how much uranium-233 do we need? Well, most of the studies done by Oak Ridge in the 60s indicated that we can start a 1 gigawatt thorium reactor with about 1 ton of uranium-233. Well, how much do we have right now? We have about 1 ton. So we can only start 1 reactor, right? Well, with uranium-233, yes, but we need to go about quickly converting our fissile materials into uranium-233 so we can start more. Well, why does it only take 1 ton of uranium-233 to start a thorium reactor, but it takes 5 to 10 tons of plutonium to start a fast breeder? Well, here's why. Things look a lot different when you're a slowed down neutron versus a fast neutron. When you're a fast neutron, all the fuel looks really small to you, and you have a whole lot less probability of causing fission. So you need a lot more fuel to ensure that you have enough collisions with fuel to generate the energy you need. On the other hand, when you're a slowed down neutron, each fuel nucleus looks a lot bigger and you have a much better chance of causing fission. So having slowed down neutrons makes your fuel go a lot further than having fast neutrons. This is the basic reason why a thorium reactor with slowed down neutrons can start with a lot less fuel for a given power rating than a fast reactor with fast neutrons. Each little bit of fuel counts for a lot more in a reactor with slowed down neutrons. We don't have to limit ourselves to just uranium-233 to start these thorium reactors. We can use the highly enriched uranium that we're recovering from all the nuclear weapons we're decommissioning to help us. We can also use the plutonium that we're recovering from those weapons. We can use the plutonium that's been generated in our reactors over the last 60 years to help us. By using slowed down neutrons and thorium, the startup power of this fuel is magnified by 500 to 1,000% over a fast reactor. But why should we do first? Well, the first thing we should do is we should stop the Department of Energy's effort to destroy the 1 ton of uranium-233 that we still have. They don't think that uranium-233 has any value to their mission, and they're going to spend $500 million to mix it down with uranium-238 and throw it away in the desert. That's a bad idea. We need that 233, and we're going to need a lot more. The next step is to get going on the research and development of the liquid fluoride thorium reactor. This is the machine that can burn thorium as a fuel and only needs about a ton of U-233 or other fissile material to start it up. The U.S. hasn't invested any money in LFTR since 1974, the year I was born. Other countries are making investments, and we need to get going before we're completely left behind on something we invented. At our enrichment plants around this country, we have 470,000 metric tons of depleted uranium hexafluoride. That's a uranium atom with 6 fluorine atoms around it. We need to get that fluorine and convert the uranium to something that's chemically stable and can be buried. Uranium oxide is what this stuff was before we dug it out of the earth, and that's what we need to turn it back into. Each time we do this, we free up 6 atoms of fluorine that we'll need for the rest of our plant. This means that 470,000 tons of uranium hexafluoride can be converted into 360,000 tons of uranium oxide and 150,000 tons of fluorine. Next, we use some of that fluorine, about 30% of it, to fluorinate all of the spent nuclear fuel we've already generated from existing reactors. 95% of that spent nuclear fuel is uranium oxide and will be converted to uranium hexafluoride, which is exactly the form we needed in to put it in an enrichment plant. So we could go ahead and send it to an enrichment plant and use it that way if we desire. But I'm more interested in the other 5% of what's in the spent nuclear fuel. 1% is plutonium, americium, neptunium, and other actinides that are called transuranics. These are the higher actinides that are generated when uranium absorbs a neutron and doesn't fission. These are also the substances that give planners such headaches when they think about building places like Yucca Mountain, because they're radioactive for tens to hundreds of thousands of years and comprise most of the long-term trouble. The other 4% are fission products, most of which are already nuclear stable and can be partitioned and sold for the valuable materials in them, like neodymium and xenon gas. With the transuranic fluorides we recover, we have to destroy them through fission. Waiting tens of thousands of years for them to decay isn't the right approach. We need to put them in a reactor and burn them up. Well, what's the right kind of reactor to do this? I think it's a fast reactor, but not the kind of fast reactors we generally hear about these days. I think it's a fast reactor that's a cousin to the liquid fluoride thorium reactor, except it's one that will use liquid chloride salts that are chemically stable as fuel and coolant, not the liquid sodium metal that is currently proposed. Again, like other fast reactors, it will take 5 to 10 tons of these transuranics to produce a gigawatt of power. So what have we bought by this approach? Well, just this, that in the liquid chloride reactors, we can jacket the reactor with thorium and make new uranium-233 even as we destroy plutonium. This means for every year we burn up plutonium, will make enough uranium-233 to start a new gigawatt-class lifter. Compared to the fast breeder approach, where you're trying to breed new plutonium to make more fast breeders, and it takes 20 to 30 years to produce enough new fuel in a fast reactor to start another one, we won't be using these chloride fast reactors to start other fast reactors. We'll be using them to make the fuel to start fluoride thorium reactors that use slowed down neutrons. Even with this approach, plutonium from weapons and reactor fuel will start about 70 chloride fast reactors. And each one will make enough uranium-233 to start 70 new lifters at a gigawatt each. This means that in less than 20 years, we'll have 1,000 lifters online, generating all the energy our nation needs. And all the while, we're burning down and destroying the plutonium that we've generated over the last 60 years for weapons and from reactor operation. Compare that to the standard breeder approach, where in 20 years, the 70 fast breeders will have only generated enough new fuel for another 70 fast breeders. And you can see how quickly uranium-233 and slowed down neutrons let you move ahead and replace coal and other fossil fuels. Remember all that fluorine? Well, it's going to end up combined with lithium, beryllium, and thorium to make the fuel for the 1,000 lifters we're going to build. Those 1,000 lifters are going to burn about 1,000 tons of thorium each year to make all this energy, which is about a quarter of what one mine site in Idaho with a pit the size of a football field could produce. I'm assured our friend Jim Kennedy will make sure that we'll have 1,000 tons, if not more, of thorium if we need it. And again, thorium and slowed down neutrons can let you be much more efficient in your nuclear strategy. At the end of this effort, we will have destroyed our 100 tons of highly enriched uranium from weapons. We will have destroyed our 100 tons of weapons-grade plutonium from decommissioned weapons. We will have destroyed the 700 tons of plutonium and transuranic actinides in the spent nuclear fuel. We will have essentially eliminated the issue of spent nuclear fuel as a concern. We will have replaced the coal and gas electrical generation in this country, and we will have added enough additional electrical generation to the nation's grid to power electric cars rather than gasoline-powered ones. We'll have cleaner air, we'll have cleaner water, we'll keep hundreds of billions of dollars in our country every year because we'll be energy independent, and we will have solved the energy crisis permanently. All of this can be unlocked from the fundamental properties of thorium. We can make it happen, and may we have the wisdom to do so. Thank you. Any time for questions? John.
Is that disposal strategy the same one you had proposed to the Department of Energy about 4 months ago?
Yes, that is the same strategy. Kim?
Yes, I noticed you got the acronym LCFR. Is that a liquid chloride reactor?
Liquid chloride fast reactor.
Liquid chloride fast reactor.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's just all chlorides.
Yeah.
Of the right weight of chlorine, right?
Yeah. Isotope.
I wanted to point out, Kirk, you mentioned how it's very hard to find numbers on the fast breeder reactors. When you finally find these old dusty documents that let some of the numbers slip out, it's actually a lot higher.
Yes.
It's more like 18, 20 tons of plutonium from a spent fuel, which has about 12 tons. IFR can drop that down a little bit, but if you're trying to use U-235, which is a little cheaper for them, it's back up to like 20 tons, 18 tons.
And that initial inventory for the fast reactor, comparing it to the fluoride reactor, makes really all the difference in how fast you can implement this strategy. Is there
Repeat the question.
Oh, I'm sorry. He pointed out that it's hard to find specific numbers on how much fissile it takes to start these fast reactors, but some numbers look as high as 18 to 20. I was using 5 to 10 in the document, so the higher you go, the slower it goes. Sir?
My name is Takashi coming from Kyoto University.
Welcome. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. I have a question. You mentioned about the fissile in order to start the thorium reactor. You mentioned about the high HEU or plutonium or the uranium plutonium coming from the spent nuclear fuel. But do you think that it is essential or necessary to use the breeding facility like the accelerated reactor system or other nuclear fusion reactors?
Do I think it's essential to use a breeding facility to generate?
It's necessary or not necessary?
I think it may not be necessary, but I think to do a real thorough job in destroying these transuranics and replacing the need for a repository, I think fast reactors of some sort will be necessary. The basic difference between the strategy I'm proposing and the strategy that the fast reactor community proposes, they want to build fast reactors that double and then increase that way, always generating more plutonium to start more fast breeders. I want to use fast reactors just to destroy transuranics and build new 233. So there would be a point after operating them. Basically, once you burned up all the plutonium, you'd shut the fast reactors down, and then you just run on thorium lifters from then on. So, other question?
Do you think there would be a way to show Russia and other people who have lots of wastes around that this is a good deal?
I certainly hope so, because the United States is, I focus this on the United States, but it's very applicable to other nations, especially Japan, Russia, France, other countries that have mature nuclear fuel cycles. For countries that don't have mature nuclear fuel cycles, nations like the United States or Japan could get them started with the U-233 they need to get going on their lifters. And they wouldn't have to create these other things, because we have a waste legacy that we're trying to get past. We're trying to deal with this spent nuclear fuel and this accumulation of transuranics. The transuranics, they decay so slowly that waiting them out is not a good idea. That takes tens of thousands of years. The way to get rid of them is to burn them up in a reactor. It kind of reminds me a little bit of the ring from Lord of the Rings. You know, you can't break it. You got to throw it in the volcano to get rid of it.
This may come out later, but is there a general cost structure that you could put down relating to the lifter and the various choices that we have currently and so forth per gigawatt?
I don't have a cost breakdown for lifter, and we need to do more detailed analysis.
Yeah.
I think that's a lot what John was talking about, is to get into the brass tacks and cost these things out. A lot of us have good ideas why it should be a lot cheaper, but they're not quantified yet, I have to admit. Last question.
John Chapman, Chapman Group. So Lightbridge is working a seed blanket technology, which is the same concept to use thorium as a conversion over from the uranium cycle. So contrast that with this approach with liquid salt.
The seed blanket approach will burn up a fraction of thorium, but they don't achieve even a conversion ratio of 1 in their reactors because of using it in the light water reactors. So it's far, far, far less than this approach. I'm assuming that lifters, once deployed, have a conversion ratio of 1, which means they just run on thorium forever after that. With the Lightbridge approach, you would have to keep feeding it new fissile material. So it's not really all that different than what we're doing with our light water reactors today. You would have to continually make new fuel, and I don't think they have a plan to reprocess their spent fuel when they're done. I think they're assuming it goes in a Yucca Mountain style place. This plan is designed to try to make the Yucca Mountain problem go away, and the Lightbridge approach doesn't do that.
Yes, sir. Sam Bates, Idaho National Laboratory. Question, some of your curves showed nuclear energy growth scenarios.
Mm-hmm.
So what's the doubling time for a molten salt reactor compared to, say, an IFR type facility?
Well, in this scenario, there is no doubling time because the reactor has a conversion ratio of 1. So once you start the lifter, it just runs with a conversion ratio of 1. The growth in fissile is coming by converting by converting plutonium and HEU to U-233 for lifters. And one thing they didn't mention in the talk is at the end state of the fast breeder world, if you had 1,000 fast breeders and they had 15 tons a piece of plutonium in the core, that means you got 15,000 tons of plutonium fissile in your inventory. At the end state of this, you have 1,000 tons of U-233 in your inventory, which is a whole lot easier to keep nice, shall we say, than plutonium.
So that's a replacement scenario, not a growth scenario.
Well, 1,000 gigawatts is a lot more than replacement. We have 100 gigawatts today. 1,000 gigawatts is designed to replace actually more than replace our entire electrical energy generation capacity, with additional in there to allow us to go to electrification of transportation as well. So, but I'm trying to get, how do we get off fossil fuels? How do we get off fossil fuels, get past the Yucca problem, destroy spent nuclear fuel, destroy weapons grade material? So, well, last question, Lars.
Lars Jorgensen. So I think a better way to say it than a doubling time might be, how long does it take you to get to a final full production of energy, which we can define as 1,000 gigawatts for the US, so it's 1. 2 is, you talked about how you could start the fast breeders, but I didn't quite catch on as to where the plutonium or uranium is to keep them flowing for those 20-odd years to produce that.
Yeah, use the spent nuclear fuel from our light water reactors, what we call waste today. We use the 1% or so of that's plutonium to start those fast reactors that are going to destroy that and create uranium-233 from thorium. So that's the first part. As far as how long does this scenario take, I've been working on modeling this, and I know you've worked a lot on modeling this too. I don't have an answer for that yet. I mean, one of the things I showed in here is if you could snap your fingers and the chloride reactors were all built and U-233 was your long pole, it would take less than 20 years. But obviously it's going to take time to build those chloride reactors and also to get lifter technology going on. So I think it could be done in about 40 years. I've been amazed how fast, looking back on our history of nuclear power production, how fast we got light water reactors online, to the tune of almost 50 gigawatts per decade. It was really impressive in the 70s and 80s how fast it was coming on. All right, so I'll move on. I'll let our next speaker come along. Thank you so much.
That guy says, hey, new laser pointer for me. All right, so without further ado, we have an especially exciting guest speaker here, Rick Martin. He wears many hats, but the one you are all probably very familiar with is that he wrote the wonderful Wired article about thorium. So I think he's done more than a lot of us could ever hope to do through that mighty big speaker box. So here you go, Rick. Thank you for coming, man. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, John. I'm glad I could make it. My byline is Richard, but you can all call me Rick. And a little bit about me. First of all, I'm based in Boulder, Colorado. As John said, I wear many hats, including I've been a contributing editor for Wired for going on 10 years, probably 8 years or so. I also do some energy analysis for Pike Research, which is a small clean tech research firm that's based in Boulder. And so you can, the Wired story came out in January and was based on reporting and interviews with a lot of people in this room, particularly Kirk. And the way I came onto the thorium story is kind of interesting in itself. Like I said, I've been covering energy for 20 years. Went to Central Asia back in '97 to cover the Caspian Sea oil boom at a time when most Western journalists couldn't find the Caspian Sea on a map. So I've tromped around a lot of oil fields in my life, but obviously seeing renewable as the future. One of the blogs I read is called The Oil Drum, and I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with it. And I saw a blog by Charles, and what's his last name?
Barton.
Yeah, Charles Barton, whose father was a chemist, I believe, at Oak Ridge in the 60s, worked under Alvin Weinberg, who was really the father of thorium research in this country. And so that's how I got interested in it. And a couple of interesting notes about that story. And the URL is here in case you haven't seen it. This presentation will be available on the Thorium Energy Alliance website after the conference, so you can go find it there. The search engine at wired.com is not always totally reliable. But a couple of interesting notes about that story, one of which was I'm a freelancer, and when you pitch a story to Wired, they have a pitch meeting, right? And there's half a dozen to 10 story pitches at any given meeting. And so there's probably 6 or 8 editors in there, and they're pretty, some of the most savvy science and tech editors in the business today. Not a one of them had heard of thorium except for my editor to whom I presented the pitch. So that'll give you an idea of how new this is to people outside this room and how unaware the sort of mainstream media has been to date about thorium and its potential. The other thing I'll just say about that story is it's gotten more feedback, both the comments section on the website, which Kirk has been very active in, as well as direct emails to me, more feedback than I've gotten probably for all the stories I've written for Wired combined. So again, that'll give you an idea of what this movement is sparking and what John and Kirk and the others with the Alliance have managed to pull off so far. What I'm going to do today is just give you a brief news update on developments around thorium, particularly around government policy, regulation, etc. So some of the big events that have happened in the last few months since I sort of completed my reporting for the story itself. One of which is, again, as many of you in this room know, the Thorium Energy Independence Act has been reintroduced for at least the 3rd time. right? It's never made it out of committee in past Congresses, and it was introduced by Senators Hatch and Reed. Various provisions to support the development, the R&D around thorium in this country, including setting up an office for thorium fuel cycle research in the DOE, creating a regulatory framework for thorium power generation, which I think is kind of one of those plumbing things that John talked about that's really necessary. It's unglamorous, but we need it if things are going to move forward. Sort of vaguely talks about starting demonstration projects for thorium-based reactors and creating, again, unspecified international partnerships for non-proliferation through deployment of thorium-based generation. It's been interesting to watch the non-proliferation community. There's kind of a split in that community around between people who are simply anti-nuke across the board. Anything having to do with nuclear power generation is bad. We can't have it. And others who are more open-minded, more forward-thinking, and who actually do see thorium as a potential path forward for nuclear power without the proliferation issues that uranium-based reactors create. And the bill would provide $250 million in funding over 5 years starting next year, which by my, from where I sit, is a drop in the bucket in this context. And it's not going to get us anywhere near to, 20 lifters in the next 20 years. So we need more, but it is a start. Whether it has a chance in this Congress of passage is anybody's guess. And the other thing I will say is obviously Harry Reid and Orrin Hatch are odd political bedfellows, to say the least, and they really came together on this through their mutual opposition to Yucca Mountain. And there has been a proposed storage facility in Utah as well, and Hatch is obviously opposed to that. So it's a rare example of bipartisanship in today's Congress. So let's hope there's a chance for it. Meanwhile, of course, the really big news in this country is that the Obama administration has come out strongly in support of nuclear power in general. And there have been a couple of statements, one speech in particular by President Obama recently. He's talking about providing $8 billion in loan guarantees for new plants. In the budget request for next year, the DOE would have funding to support 6 to 9 new reactors, $39 million for small modular reactors, which I'll talk more about in just a minute, and creating a new DOE research center called the Nuclear Energy Modeling and Simulation Hub, as well as a Blue Ribbon Commission on America's Nuclear Future, all of which is kind of a way of saying let's do this without really putting a lot of political will and a lot of support behind it, but simply the fact that a Democratic administration has come out very explicitly in support of nuclear power, I think is a huge step for this country. Again, how much of that will come to pass is anybody's guess. The permitting process for nuclear plants is really the bottleneck, and to get a new plant permitted in this country, it's a decade-long process. And there are private companies going through that process right now, and clearly the industry wants to build new reactors, uranium-based, of course. In the course of reporting the thorium story for Wired, I talked to the CEO of Exelon, which is one of the biggest nuclear power producers in this country, and I asked him about thorium, and he said, well, we're looking at all aspects of the nuclear fuel cycle, but we've got uranium, it seems to work, we got a lot of it, so why switch? So that's kind of the attitude of what I would call the nuclear power establishment. Earlier this month, Energy Secretary Stephen Chu came out with an editorial in the Wall Street Journal in which he even more explicitly supported nuclear power, talking about powering 6 million American homes, creating tens of thousands of jobs in the coming years. And he included this line, which I think is something that